Yeah, Herman.
Why are we outside?
Well, it's a beautiful day. I thought it'd be nice to get out.
Oh, okay, that makes sense then.
No, Herman, it's because we got evicted.
We got evicted? Why weren't you paying rent? I gave you money to pay rent!
Why should I pay some white guy to live on land that isn't even his? I pay my rent directly to the Dakota Nation.
Yes, but it's okay, so we've been evicted.
Yup.
And that's why we're outside.
Yup.
So we're just jumping into it now, no cold open.
Yeah, we're rolling with it, playing it fast and loose, staying breezy.
Okay, well, let's cut the crap then, I guess. What's sovereignty?
Why don't we start with where you first saw that word and in what context?
I've been seeing a lot of things on the news about people saying that such and such thing is infringing on their sovereignty.
Well, the legal definition is that sovereignty is the basic right of a nation to govern themselves.
So basically, you can decide what's best for you and your people.
Well, not that you get to decide what's best for everyone, but that you get a say in the process.
Sovereignty sounds like a pretty good thing to have then.
It sure is, though sovereignty is inconvenient if you're trying to oppress someone else.
Oh, so for example, if you were trying to take over someone's land, it would be a bad thing if they decided to exercise their sovereign rights.
Exactly. When a nation invades another, they infringe on the other nation's sovereignty.
Okay, but what defines a nation?
Well, that's a question for a political scientist, but for our purposes, a nation is a group of people. They could share a history, or a culture, or a language, or they could just be in the same place at the same time.
Like Sesame Street.
Sure, like Sesame Street.
Can you join a nation?
Well, lots of people have been on Sesame Street.
That's true, sometimes people come and go from Sesame Street. Like Kermit.
As long as people recognize each other as members of Sesame Street, they can be a nation, even if other nations don't recognize them.
Well, why would other nations not want to recognize Sesame Street?
Well, lots of reasons. Sometimes it's racism. Sometimes nations tell other nations they won't recognize them so they can exploit them.
Oh, and that infringes on their sovereignty.
Exactly.
But who would do a thing like that? Oh yeah, the United States government, duh.
Let's count to 10 in Ojibwe. Bejik. Nish. Niswi. Niwin. Nanan. Ngodaswe. Nijwaswe. Nijwaswe. Jangswe. Madaswe. Why, hello there. Are you ready to hear a creation story? Today's Ojibwe creation story comes to us from Edward Benton Banai. Haki, the earth, Nibajisus, the moon, and Jiswis, the sun, were created by Kichimanitu. From the earth comes all living things. Water is her lifeblood. It flows through her, nourishes and purifies her. On the surface of the earth, all is given 4 sacred directions: north, south, east, and west. The young earth was filled with beauty. Gichimanitu sent his singers in the form of birds to carry the seeds of life in 4 directions. This is how life was spread across the earth. Gichimanitu placed swimming creatures in the water, and placed crawling and walking creatures on land. All things lived in harmony with each other. Gichimanitu then took 4 parts of the earth and blew into them using a shell. From the 4 elements and his breath, man was created. Gichimanitu lowered man to earth. Man was the last life form that came to be placed on earth. From this original man came the Anishinaabe people. In Ojibwe, if you break down the word Anishinaabe, this is what it means. Thank you for joining us for today's creation story. See you next time. Let's learn the 4 sacred directions in Ojibwe. Waban, east. Ngabian, west. Giwedin, north. Jawan, south.
So how do you get to be sovereign? Do you sign some sort of document?
Well, sovereignty is inherent. Signing documents with other nations can mean that they recognize your sovereignty.
So if I were to sign a document with the United States where I recognize them and they recognize me, that would be exercising my sovereignty.
Exactly. Indigenous nations can exercise sovereignty by signing treaties. But the treaty is just an affirmation of sovereignty. It's not the basis.
Now, Nimoy, I would just love an example if you happen to have one.
Sure. You know how we've done fun interactive things where you're a character in the history we're telling and you interact with the story?
Yeah, it's a great pedagogical tool. I learned so much by experiencing.
Well, we're not going to do that today.
Why not?
Well, because the only role I have for you is Bureau of Indian Affairs agent trying to get the Ojibwe to give up their land.
I am perfectly fine not doing that.
Okay, so in the 1880s, the Ojibwe are confined to reservations. Right now, the land isn't owned by any one individual, but by the whole nation collectively.
And
the U.S. government wants this land.
Well, why do they want it?
Well, the Ojibwe reservations have beautifully maintained forests.
Does the U.S. have forests?
No, they cut them all down.
Sucks to suck, I guess.
Nationally, Senator Henry Dawes has been pushing a bold new plan to take indigenous land.
But they collectively own the land. It says so in the treaties. How does this work?
Okay, so right now, they own the whole land and live on it. But what if, instead of owning it all together, they each only owned a little bit of land?
Explain, preferably with a graphic.
Dawes' plan would take some indigenous people and say that the land belongs directly to them.
Every indigenous person?
No, just some men who were deemed Indian enough.
Okay, so they've been arbitrarily told that they own their own plot of land.
Right, but now there's all this land that no one person owns. This is the surplus land.
So what happens to that land, according to Dawes?
That land becomes property of the U.S. government.
Why?
Yeah, because Dawes said so.
I hate this. Have I mentioned that I hate this? Just to clarify, this all very clearly violates the treaties that the U.S. signed with the Ojibwe, and also all the other treaties the U.S. signed.
Yep.
And the U.S. government is just going ahead and doing it anyway.
Yep.
Nimoy, could you please remind me which countries voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007?
Where there would be Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States.
Great, so nothing changes. Time is a flat circle. Please continue.
So the Dawes Act passes Congress in 1887. In 1889, Newt Nelson introduces to the Minnesota legislature an act for the relief and civilization of the Chippewa Indians.
This sounds bad.
It would become known as the Nelson Act.
And what did it do?
Well, basically the same thing as the Dawes Act, but Minnesota specific.
Great, and how did this go over?
Well, everyone was forced to accept it, except for the Red Lake Nation.
And what did they do?
Or they told the state government to go itself.
You know, good for them.
They agreed to keep collective ownership of the land, instead giving up a portion of it to the state government.
Nimoy, every time I think I can't hate the U.S. government even more, you just keep finding new ways.
It's one of my many gifts. Many words in English are borrowed from Ojibwe. Moose comes from moose. Moccasin comes from magizin. Toboggan comes from joshkotaban. Wigwam comes from wigwam. Chipmunk comes from ajdamunk.
Okay, so then what's tribal sovereignty?
Well, that's the idea that indigenous tribal nations are also sovereign. I think that noted portrait painter and war criminal George W. Bush put it best.
Tribal sovereignty means that it's sovereign. It means you've been given sovereignty and you're viewed as a sovereign entity. Okay. And therefore, the relationship between the federal government and tribes is one between sovereign entities.
So what famed children's storybook reader and shoe target George W. Bush is saying is that the relationship between indigenous nations and the United States government should be a relationship between sovereign entities.
Yeah, that's the answer he fell backwards into. Sovereignty has many forms. Another one is cultural sovereignty, the right to use and continue to use language, values, and traditions.
That sounds pretty important.
It is important. A shared language and culture help bring a people together and help them recognize each other as members of a shared culture.
I bet you're gonna tell me that the US also tries to undermine the cultural sovereignty of indigenous nations too, huh?
Actually, no, the US has been very respectful of indigenous languages and cultures. It always has been.
Oh, good one, Nimoy.
Yeah, no, they're the worst. The US government has made systemic efforts to undermine indigenous cultures because undermining culture undermines sovereignty.
Oh, and because culture is one of the things that helps people identify as a nation, erasing that culture harms the people and therefore the nation.
Exactly. The point of forcing indigenous people into boarding schools was to destroy the language and culture and disconnect indigenous peoples from their communities and from the land.
But what would the US stand to gain from destroying the cultures of other nations?
Well, in many cases, by destroying the people, they could try and destroy the nation, which meant that there would be no one to resist their claim of land.
Those bastards.
Yup.
But even though there aren't forced residential boarding schools anymore, I bet that doesn't end the threats to indigenous sovereignty.
Or you're right, the threats continue. It takes action to preserve sovereignty. But from legal battles to language programs, indigenous nations continue to resist.
It seems that the US really won't rest until indigenous nations are fully destroyed.
Yep, it comes across in all sorts of ways, from environmental threats to the water you drink and the food you eat.
Wait, what does food have to do with sovereignty?
Oh, I'm glad you asked.
You literally set me up to ask that exact question.
Let's talk to someone who does work around food sovereignty. Thank you so much for talking with us, Cassie. I guess to start off, what exactly is food sovereignty?
Food sovereignty is a nation's ability to feed themselves. In the same way that languages and traditions bring people together through cultural sovereignty, food sovereignty means that people can produce, process, and consume the foods that they want in ways that they see best fit.
That sounds pretty important.
Cultural identity is inextricably tied to food production and consumption in the traditions that they carry. And so therefore, it's one of the greatest forms of resistance to colonization and capitalism.
Those are important things to resist.
We hear a lot about food security these days as kind of a response to food deserts and people going hungry. But I feel that food security is just not the entire story. It's normally rooted in economic issues, and it doesn't look at the historical context and the roots of hunger, such as cultural genocide and racism. And sometimes these modern nonprofits that work with them are actually financing more corporate growth rather than more grassroots movement. So
it's always capitalism, isn't it?
Yep.
Can you tell me about how you got involved in this work?
Food sovereignty drew me in because it has a pretty inclusive framework that involves supporting the producers and empowering consumers in this generation and the next. And so I studied sustainability and what makes an ethical food system, and I found that food sovereignty is the best answer that we have for ensuring that people are fed in the ways that they want to be, rather than in ways that they're told to, or more oppressive programs.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Greener Pastures program I think you're working with now?
I worked with Greener Pastures for my senior capstone project as an intern, and then later on as a freelance curator. And together we created a zine that centers on hot dish, which, if you're not familiar with it, is like one of the unofficial dishes of Minnesota. And we kind of deconstructed it to include a more diverse narrative. It's a lot of the Minnesota food system is pretty Eurocentric dominated, and doesn't necessarily talk about the many different stories and history of immigration and pre-colonial diets and things like that. So this theme that we made is, we worked with BIPOC chefs in the area and talked more about ingredients that were grown here and native to here, such as wild rice, and then foods that were brought here through passing down traditions like Hmong mustard greens, and also foods that people are just really, they find a lot of comfort in, like tater tots, and how those can blend together to be something more inclusive. And yeah.
Well, that sounds like really important work. I'm glad you're doing it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a lot of fun.
And you also worked with Sean Sherman a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So Sean Sherman has the Indigenous Food Lab and the sous chef as his two-part organization, and I worked on the sous chef side. And I was a cook there, and it was amazing to get to work with foods that pre-Columbian foods, I guess is how they defined it. But yeah, getting to forage and get to know the berries and the meats and the plants that grow here, rather than things like dairy and imported wheats and other things. And yeah, it's a really wonderful organization, and they're opening a restaurant soon.
Very exciting.
Spring. So yeah, check them out.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us, Cassie.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, that was informative. I guess this takes us to the word of the day.
Today's word of the day is sovereignty.
Sovereignty is the inherent right of a people to decide what's best for themselves. Hey, Nimoy,
Yeah?
I got a closing joke for you.
Yeah?
What's funny about sovereignty?
I don't know, Herman. What's funny about sovereignty?
Absolutely nothing! Today's episode was brought to you by Trauma. Trauma, a moment on the lips, a lifetime on the brain.